Rain poured over the sleepless city, neon lights blurring against puddles as Emily's scooter weaved through traffic. Her delivery bag pressed against her back, half empty, her eyes heavy from a double shift. Survival left no time for rest. Inside the towering glass fortress of Stanton Enterprises, Richard Stanton, the city's untouchable CEO, prepared to seal a billion-dollar deal. Assistants buzzed like bees around him, every second accounted for. To the world, he was invincible. But power is fragile. As he crossed the marble lobby, his chest tightened. Papers slipped from his hand. The titan of glass and steel collapsed, gasping. Employees froze, too afraid or unwilling to act. The doors slid open. Emily stumbled in, rain dripping from her jacket, clutching his food order. For a moment, the worlds of the powerful and the invisible collided. Against every expectation, she dropped her bag and rushed forward, his only chance. Emily's world was nothing like the skyscrapers she delivered to. Her mornings began before dawn, when the city was still cloaked in silence, and only the hum of delivery trucks broke the air. She would brew cheap instant coffee in a chipped mug, trying to trick her body into believing it had rested. Then, before heading out, she'd tiptoe past the small bedroom where her little brother, Noah, slept, his school books stacked neatly beside a mattress that had seen better days. The apartment they shared told a story of survival. The wallpaper peeled at the corners, revealing yellowed plaster beneath. The kitchen sink dripped endlessly, the sound sometimes keeping her awake through the night. Second-hand textbooks cluttered the table, pages marked with her handwriting from years ago when she still dreamed of becoming a nurse. Those books, once her hope, now served as reminders of paths closed off by money she never had. Emily had wanted more for herself, but especially for Noah. She had once been the first to raise her hand in science class, fascinated by the way the human body worked. Nursing had felt like a calling. But when her mother passed suddenly and her father disappeared soon after, reality pushed dreams aside. Tuition fees became rent. Textbooks became delivery bags. White coats became a rain-soaked uniform that carried the scent of fast food and coffee. Yet through it all, Emily held onto one small truth she repeated like a shield. Kindness is free, but survival is expensive. She couldn't afford luxuries, but she could afford compassion, even if it cost her energy, her pride, or a smile when none came back. The streets taught her what invisibility felt like. Every day, she delivered meals to people who barely looked at her. Most never even opened the door fully, just a hand reaching out, a credit card waiting, or worse, the impatient flick of a wrist. Some treated her as though she were part of the bag she carried, useful, replaceable, forgettable. She swallowed the indignities, never letting Noah see the toll. At home, she painted a picture of strength, telling him stories about kind strangers, about how the world wasn't all cold and greedy. She wanted him to believe in goodness, even if she had to manufacture examples out of scraps of memory. The truth was, she had known goodness too, once. Years back, a local community center had offered free first aid classes. She signed up, partly out of curiosity, partly because she thought it might one day help her nursing dream. Emily remembered the feel of the CPR mannequin beneath her palms, the instructor's voice teaching her the rhythm of compressions, the importance of breath. She had carried that skill quietly, never needing it, until tonight. That forgotten training became her invisible strength, hidden beneath exhaustion and rain. It was why, when Richard collapsed in front of her, she didn't hesitate. Unlike the suited employees frozen by fear or concern for liability, Emily didn't see a billionaire. She saw a man choking for air, a human life on the line. And maybe that was the truest reflection of who she was, someone who had so little, yet still chose to give. The camera of the mind lingers on her tiny apartment again. The stacks of bills on the table, the cracked phone screen she uses to accept delivery orders, the way she tucks Noah's blanket around his shoulders before heading into the storm. Emily wasn't extraordinary in the eyes of the world, but to her brother, to the quiet moments she carved out of chaos, she was everything. Her struggles, her invisibility, her endless endurance, these weren't just backstory. They were the seeds that made her capable of stepping forward when no one else dared. When Emily placed her hands on Richard's chest in that marble lobby, she wasn't just saving a CEO. She was proving that invisibility does not mean insignificance. The world had overlooked her, but destiny had not. And from that night forward, her life and his would never be the same. Richard Stanton's world was built of glass and steel, both literally and metaphorically. His name glowed in silver letters across the tallest skyscraper in the city, Stanton Enterprises, a fortress of wealth that touched the clouds. Inside, everything gleamed. Marble lobbies polished until they mirrored the shoes of those who walked upon them, elevators that whispered as they rose, offices lined with minimalist furniture that cost more than Emily's annual rent. To outsiders, Richard was the embodiment of success. Born into privilege, educated at the most prestigious schools, he had inherited his father's empire and expanded it ruthlessly. Where others saw competition, he saw prey. Where others hesitated, he struck. The business magazines dubbed him the Cold Lion, a predator who ruled boardrooms with piercing eyes and a voice that could silence 100 men. Every second of his life was accounted for. Assistants buzzed around him with tablets and schedules. Lawyers followed in his wake, carrying contracts worth millions, and chauffeurs waited with engines running, ready to whisk him to meetings across the city. He wore watches not to tell time, but to control it, every minute wrung dry of waste. Time is money, he preached, and his empire reflected that efficiency. Yet beneath the armor of control lay something hollow. Richard was feared, not loved. His employees stood straighter when he entered a room, but none dared to make eye contact unless spoken to. At family gatherings, what few remained, his presence was a storm cloud. His sister had once confessed she found it easier to email him than speak face to face. Even his aging mother, living alone in a mansion on the coast, approached her son with formality, careful never to provoke his temper. For all his wealth, Richard dined alone more nights than not. The long tables in his penthouse suite stretched empty, candles unlit, the silence pressing against his chest. His bed was wide, the sheets cold, and though he lived above the glittering city, he often stared at the skyline with a heaviness that no boardroom victory could cure. The contrast with Emily's world could not have been sharper. While she wrestled with survival, he wrestled with meaning. She endured invisibility, he endured isolation. She had nothing, yet still gave kindness freely. He had everything, yet found himself starved of warmth. Richard would never admit this weakness, not to his staff, not to his investors, not even to himself. Instead, he buried it beneath layers of precision and control. If a pen was misplaced on his desk, he noticed. If a secretary stammered during a presentation, he remembered. His empire did not tolerate cracks, and he held himself to the same standard. Weakness was unacceptable. But loneliness is a silent thief. It crept into the edges of his days, in the pauses between phone calls, in the elevator rides where he stood surrounded by screens yet utterly alone. He watched employees whisper when they thought he wasn't looking, their laughter fading when he entered. He noticed how waiters at restaurants bowed too deeply, their smiles more rehearsed than genuine. Every interaction was transactional. Every relationship was built on fear or gain. Richard's wealth insulated him from hunger, from struggle, from the raw fight of survival that Emily knew too well. Yet in that insulation, he lost touch with humanity. He hadn't held a door open for someone in years. He hadn't carried cash for tips, relying on assistants to take care of it. He hadn't listened, not truly listened, to another person's story in decades. What Emily had in resilience, Richard lacked in connection. What she carried in her small apartment, laughter with her brother, the intimacy of shared hardship, was a treasure he could not buy. And though he would never confess it aloud, some nights Richard envied the simplicity he glimpsed in others. A couple holding hands in the rain, a family sharing street food, friends crowding into a small cafe with nothing but time. He had once told a reporter that success was measured in numbers, in deals, in how high one could climb above the competition. The headline read, "The Cold Lion, a king without rivals." But the truth was far sadder. Richard was a king without equals, without companions, without love. It was this emptiness that made his sudden collapse in the lobby so much more terrifying. For a man who prided himself on control, the betrayal of his own body was unthinkable. And when Emily knelt beside him, rain still dripping from her jacket, hands steady with compassion, Richard felt something he hadn't in years: vulnerability. For the first time, he wasn't the lion. He wasn't the CEO. He wasn't even powerful. He was just a man, fragile and mortal, looking up into the eyes of someone who saw him not as a title, not as a bank account, but as a life worth saving. And that moment, the collision of her resilience and his loneliness, was the spark that would unravel everything he thought he knew about power, control, and love. The lobby of Stanton Enterprises glimmered like a cathedral to wealth. Polished marble reflected the golden light of chandeliers suspended above, their crystal edges scattering flecks across the towering glass walls. Assistants with tailored suits and clipped voices hurried across the floor, their shoes clicking in rhythm with the pulse of the city outside. And then chaos. Richard Stanton staggered mid-step, his hand clutching at his chest. His leather portfolio slipped, scattering papers like white birds across the marble. The titan of finance, the man whose signature moved markets, gasped for air. His knees buckled, echoing against the silence as the chandelier light trembled above him. For a moment, nobody moved. The employees who idolized him, feared him, and followed his every order stood paralyzed. Some whispered in horror, others looked around as if waiting for someone else to step forward. But fear of liability, of touching the untouchable CEO, held them frozen. Time stretched painfully long. Then the glass doors hissed open. Emily rushed in, her jacket still dripping from the storm outside, clutching the delivery bag with one hand and shaking rain from her helmet with the other. She blinked, stunned at the sight before her. The man she had seen on television, collapsed and gasping on the pristine floor, surrounded by immobile suits. Her bag hit the ground with a dull thud. Instinct overcame hesitation. Kneeling beside him, Emily pressed her hands against his chest. "Somebody call an ambulance," she shouted, her voice cutting through the fog of fear. The employees exchanged nervous glances but still hesitated. A security guard stepped forward, uncertain. "Ma'am, you can't." "Do you want him to die?" Emily snapped, her voice fierce. The guard froze, then reluctantly signaled another worker to call emergency services. Emily's palms pressed firmly against Richard's chest, the rhythm of compressions echoing in her mind from that long-ago community class. She counted under her breath. 1, 2, 3, breathe. Her breath filled his lungs as she bent close, the contrast between her rain-soaked uniform and his silk tie a jarring picture of worlds colliding. Whispers rippled across the lobby. "She's touching him. Who is she?" "A delivery girl." But Emily didn't hear them. Her focus narrowed to the man beneath her hands, his face paling, his lips tightening. She pressed harder, forcing life back into the man who had never once known what it meant to be invisible. Seconds dragged into eternity. The chandelier flickered above, the marble echoing with her desperate rhythm. And then Richard's chest jolted. His eyes fluttered open, a rasping breath tearing through him. Gasps erupted from the gathered employees. Relief mixed with disbelief. The delivery girl saved him. Richard blinked, vision hazy, until his gaze met hers. For the first time in years, someone was looking at him not with fear, not with expectation, but with simple, unguarded humanity. He saw no calculation in Emily's eyes, only determination, compassion, and exhaustion carved into her rain-soaked face. For a fleeting moment, the marble lobby, the wealth, the whispers, all of it fell away. There was only a fragile man, brought back to life by a woman who had no reason to care, no stake in his empire, and yet had given him everything she had in that instant. Emily sat back as paramedics rushed through the glass doors. She wiped her forehead with a trembling hand, her heart pounding. Richard's assistants finally came alive, circling around with anxious orders and frantic voices. But Richard's gaze never left her. Humility, an emotion foreign to him, flooded his chest as he realized his life had been saved not by the wealth he had built, not by the power he wielded, but by someone the world never noticed. Compassion met fragility in that moment. A delivery girl and a billionaire CEO, bound by breath, by heartbeat, by the undeniable truth that no amount of money could buy what she had just given him. And in that silence between them, Richard Stanton felt small for the very first time. The marble lobby was a blur of noise and uniforms. Paramedics lifted Richard onto a stretcher, wires and oxygen masks transforming the once untouchable CEO into just another patient. Assistants trailed behind with tablets and contracts clutched tight, their voices sharp, rehearsed, panicked. Emily stood off to the side, drenched, her delivery bag slumped on the floor. She had just given everything, her energy, her courage, her breath. Yet now she was invisible again. An assistant in a navy suit finally approached her, his expression stiff. "Thank you for helping," he said flatly, as though the words were stones lodged in his throat. He pressed a few folded bills into her damp hand. "This should cover the order, and a tip." Emily stared at the money, stunned. Not a word of gratitude, not a name asked, not even eye contact that lasted more than a second. She wanted to protest, to tell them this wasn't about payment, but exhaustion weighed heavier than pride. Her brother was waiting at home. She tucked the bills into her pocket, picked up her soggy bag, and slipped quietly back into the storm. The city swallowed her once more, neon lights reflecting in puddles, scooter engine humming through the rain. She should have felt bitter. Instead, there was a strange warmth in her chest. She hadn't saved a billionaire, she had saved a man. And for once, invisibility hadn't mattered. Back in her small apartment, Noah greeted her sleepily at the door. She tousled his hair, whispered, "Go back to bed, buddy," and forced a smile. She didn't tell him about the marble lobby or the whispers or the weight of a man's life beneath her palms. She only brewed another cup of instant coffee, sank into the worn chair, and let the rain outside lull her into a quiet pride. But across the city, in a penthouse that overlooked the glittering skyline, Richard Stanton couldn't find rest. He lay in a bed larger than Emily's entire apartment, the sheets too smooth, too cold. The doctors had said he was stable, that it was exhaustion mixed with stress, but his mind replayed only one thing: those eyes. The rain-darkened face of a girl who had leaned over him without hesitation, who had given him breath when no one else dared to move. For years, he had been surrounded by people who bowed, obeyed, and measured their words. Yet this stranger, drenched, exhausted, unimportant in the eyes of his world, had looked at him with nothing but determination and compassion. Not fear, not calculation, pure humanity. His office the next day felt unbearable. The glass walls, once a symbol of his dominance, now echoed emptiness. Assistants moved briskly, offering summaries and schedules, but their voices faded into background noise. Every polished surface seemed to reflect not his power, but his fragility. Richard found himself staring at the spot on the marble floor where he had collapsed, imagining her kneeling there, defying the silence. He asked himself questions he had never considered. Who was she? Why had she helped when no one else moved? And why couldn't he shake the memory of her touch, the steadiness of her hands? He told himself it was curiosity, gratitude perhaps, but beneath that rationalization grew something deeper. An obsession, fragile and unspoken, began to bloom. Richard Stanton, the cold lion, the man who never asked about strangers, was now haunted by one. And before long, he would move mountains to know her name. Richard Kane did not like owing anyone. Gratitude in his dictionary was weakness dressed in polite words. Yet for days after that night in the marble lobby, the memory of Emily haunted him. The delivery girl who had dared touch him, press her hands to his chest, breathe life into a man the world thought untouchable. His empire continued to hum like a well-oiled machine. Conference calls at dawn, stock tickers streaming across the giant screens in his penthouse office, assistants rushing to keep up with his relentless pace. But amidst the sharp efficiency, there was a fracture, a name he could not shake: Emily. He arranged it carefully, as he did everything. Not a simple meeting. It had to be staged in his world on his terms. A handwritten note was too personal, an assistant's call too dismissive. So he sent a formal invitation, embossed card, gold lettering, to a dinner at Le Mirage, the most exclusive restaurant in the city. When Emily received it, she thought it was a mistake. Delivery girls did not dine where chandeliers resembled falling stars, and a single glass of wine cost more than her week's earnings. But curiosity and a stubborn spark inside her forced her to go. She wore her cleanest jacket, patched carefully at the elbows, and tied her hair back in a way that felt presentable. The moment she stepped into Le Mirage, her breath faltered. Polished marble floors reflected crystal light. Waiters glided like dancers. Every table was draped in silk, every guest wrapped in jewels and arrogance. Eyes turned, curious, then dismissive. She could almost hear their whispers, who let her in. Richard rose from his table near the window, tall and sharp in a tailored suit that cost more than her rent for a year. He smiled faintly, but it was the kind of smile he used in boardrooms, controlled, measured. "Emily," he said, as though testing how her name tasted in his mouth. "Thank you for coming." She sat stiff and awkward, her patched sleeve brushing against velvet. The menu was a foreign language to her, words she couldn't pronounce, dishes she couldn't imagine. Her stomach tightened. This wasn't gratitude. This was exposure, a cruel reminder of the line between their worlds. For a long moment, silence stretched. Richard studied her, but for once, the power in his gaze faltered. He noticed the scuff on her shoes, the tired lines beneath her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly yet remained steady when she lifted her glass of water. "Do you come here often?" she asked suddenly, half in jest, half in defense. He almost laughed, almost. "Too often it loses its charm." "To me," she said softly, "this doesn't feel charming. It feels like a cage with chandeliers." The words pierced him. A cage. That was his empire, glass towers, golden cages. He leaned back, unsettled. The dinner was brief. Emily excused herself early, muttering something about her younger brother waiting for dinner. Richard watched her walk away, her worn jacket swallowing her frame against the glittering backdrop of the restaurant. He had thought inviting her here would show his power. Instead, it had shown him his emptiness. That night, he could not sleep. For the first time in years, his empire felt hollow. What kind of man needs a delivery girl to remind him he's alive? In the days that followed, something unthinkable happened. Richard left his glass fortress and followed her. Not openly. He told himself it was research, curiosity, but in truth it was hunger. He trailed her on rainy nights when she balanced bags of food against her chest, rushing through dark alleys to meet impossible deadlines. He saw her stand outside locked gates, waiting for customers who never tipped, who sneered when she was late. He saw her pause beneath a street lamp, shaking the rain from her hair, exhaustion painted across her face, and still smile when she answered her brother's call. Every scene was a blow. She was stronger than he had ever been. He had armies of assistants shielding him from discomfort. She had nothing but her stubborn will and a mantra whispered like prayer. Kindness is free, but survival is expensive. One evening, he watched her stop mid-run to help an old woman carry groceries up a flight of stairs, even as her delivery timer ticked toward penalty. No reward, no audience, just instinct. Richard realized then that his wealth, his skyscrapers, his boardroom applause, none of it had given him that kind of courage. He was the one who was poor, bankrupt in a currency he had never valued. Humanity. The roles had shifted. The cold lion, once feared by boardrooms and envied by competitors, found himself humbled by a girl in a patched jacket, carrying the weight of survival with grace. For the first time in his life, Richard Kane wasn't looking down at someone. He was looking up. Emily was cautious. She had lived too long in a world where promises were broken, where smiles from strangers often carried hidden debts. So when Richard Kane, the cold lion of glass towers, continued to seek her company, she pushed back. "People like you don't fall for girls like me," she told him one evening, standing by the cracked steps of her apartment. Her little brother's laughter echoed faintly from inside. She crossed her arms, her jacket too thin for the chill. "You're used to women in diamonds, not delivery girls with grease stains on their sleeves." Richard didn't flinch. His suits, his empire, his reputation, all seemed to shrink in that moment. He met her gaze with unusual honesty. "This isn't pity, Emily, it's admiration. You saved my life, and not just in the lobby. Every time I see you, you remind me what living actually looks like." She wanted to dismiss him, but there was no calculation in his voice. Only truth. Against her better judgment, she allowed small cracks in her defenses. Their meetings shifted, not in gilded restaurants or penthouse lounges, but on sidewalks under flickering streetlights. Richard followed her lead this time. He ate from the same food cart she loved, steam rising from bowls of noodles that dripped sauce onto his cufflinks. For the first time in decades, he licked his fingers, laughed at the mess, and didn't care. One night, Emily challenged him to ride her battered scooter. At first, he scoffed. Him, Richard Kane, balanced on a rattling machine worth less than his tie. But with her coaching, her hand steadying his, he wobbled down the street while she laughed so hard she nearly fell off the curb. For once, he was not the lion commanding a kingdom, but a man learning to balance on unfamiliar ground. Emily's younger brother, Daniel, was slower to warm up. He had grown protective of her, wary of anyone who looked too polished. But Richard surprised him. He knelt to help with homework, fumbling over math problems he hadn't solved since his own childhood. He bought ice cream from the corner store and sat on their worn couch, laughing at the cheap action movies Daniel adored. In those moments, Richard's walls began to crumble. His temper, once infamous in boardrooms, softened. He still demanded excellence, but now he listened before raising his voice. Secretaries whispered about the change. The lion no longer roared so often. Even his competitors noticed his tone in meetings. Less steel, more patience. Emily noticed too. She saw the way his eyes lingered not on profits, but on people. He asked about her brother's dreams, about her abandoned nursing studies, about what she wanted from life. No one had asked her that in years. Slowly, carefully, Emily began to trust. She let herself smile when he showed up unannounced with steaming coffee after her long shifts. She allowed herself to lean into the warmth of his company, though her heart still whispered warnings. "This world is not yours, Emily. Don't fall too hard." But Richard wasn't asking her to join his world. He was learning to live in hers. And with every laugh shared over street food, every scooter ride through midnight streets, every quiet evening with Daniel, they built something fragile but real. The ruthless CEO was transforming, not because Emily demanded it, but because her resilience had exposed the hollowness of his empire. She had saved his life once in a lobby of marble and chandeliers. Now, without realizing it, she was saving it again, teaching him how to live. The storm didn't arrive with thunder, it came with headlines. Cold lion caught in street romance. CEO falls for delivery girl. Investors panic as Stanton's air trades deals for noodles. From boardroom to back alley, has Richard Kane lost his mind? Every screen in the city seemed to echo the same narrative. A single photograph, Richard laughing with Emily at a food cart, her delivery jacket zipped to her chin, spread like wildfire. It wasn't romance in the public eye, it was scandal. Inside the glass tower, Richard's board was livid. Suits lined the conference table, their faces grave. "You've built an empire on strength and strategy," one director hissed. "And now you're risking it all for her?" Another chimed in. "Investors are pulling, the stock is slipping, the market thinks you've gone soft." Richard stood tall, but inside his foundation quaked. For the first time, his personal choices had put billions at risk. He could hear his father's voice, sharp as a blade. Never let feelings weaken the throne. Emily, meanwhile, bore the crueler weight. Customers whispered when she entered lobbies, their sneers disguised as jokes. "So this is the billionaire's girl?" Social media tore her apart, her clothes, her background, even her late mother. Trolls flooded her delivery app with insults. Her phone buzzed constantly, each notification a knife. She told Richard in a trembling voice, "I never asked for this." I wanted to live quietly, care for my brother, not to be your headline." His chest ached as she tried to step away. He could see her fear, her exhaustion. The woman who once saved his life now looked like she was breaking under the weight of his world. The board demanded a decision. "Distance yourself from her," the chairman warned. "Make a statement, clarify it was nothing serious. If you don't, you'll lose everything." The choice lay before him, his empire or Emily. At the next press conference, cameras flashed, investors held their breath. Richard stepped onto the stage, his tie perfectly knotted but his heart raw. He scanned the crowd, found Emily at the back, her eyes begging him not to sacrifice everything for her. And then, against every expectation, Richard said the words that would redefine his legacy. "I owe my life to a young woman who the world wants to dismiss as invisible. But she is more courageous than any executive I've ever met, more honest than any partner I've signed with, and more resilient than I will ever be. If you think loving her makes me weak, then perhaps I was never strong to begin with." Gasps rippled across the room. Investors slammed their phones on tables, headlines exploded within seconds. Emily covered her mouth, tears threatening to spill. But as Richard walked off the stage, the real twist unfolded. In a private chamber, the board whispered furiously. "He's gone too far," one muttered. "He'll sink the company." Another leaned forward, eyes cold as glass. "Then we remove him, quietly, for the sake of the empire." For Richard and Emily, love had just begun to bloom. But in the shadows, betrayal was already sharpening its blade. The board moved swiftly, their knives sharpened under the cover of professionalism. Within a week, Richard Kane was stripped of his title. Temporary leave, they called it, but he knew the truth: it was exile. The empire he had built, the tower of glass and steel that bore his name, turned its back on him. For the first time in decades, Richard walked out of Stanton Enterprises without bodyguards, without cameras, without power. Just a man in a dark coat, carrying silence heavier than any fortune. And yet, strangely, he felt lighter. Emily found him that night on the cracked steps of her apartment. He sat beside her, shoulders hunched, staring at the city skyline. "It's gone," he muttered. "The company, the respect, everything my father drilled into me." She placed a quiet hand over his. "Not everything. You're still breathing. You're still here. And for the first time, you're free to decide what kind of man you want to be." Her words struck deeper than any boardroom betrayal. For years, Richard had measured his worth in contracts and stock prices. Now he began to see wealth in smaller, brighter places. Emily's laughter, Daniel's hopeful eyes, the warmth of a cheap cup of coffee shared at dawn. It was Emily who planted the seed. What if we used what we have left to help others? Not billions, just something real, something that matters. Together, they began small. With Emily's delivery routes as a blueprint and Richard's last remaining contacts in logistics, they launched a grassroots effort, delivering hot meals, medical kits, and supplies to families who had been forgotten by the city's glittering skyline. At first, it was just a handful of deliveries, Richard himself driving a van down rain-slick streets while Emily organized boxes with her practiced efficiency. Daniel tagged along, his smile wide as he handed out food. But word spread quickly. The former CEO who once ruled a skyscraper now knocking on doors in forgotten neighborhoods. Media cameras found them again, but this time, the narrative was different. Headlines shifted from scandal to redemption. The CEO who found his humanity. From boardroom to backstreets, Richard Kane delivers hope. What began as a whisper grew into a movement. Volunteers joined. Donations poured in. Families who once cursed his name now shook his hand in gratitude. For the first time in his life, Richard wasn't feared, he was admired. And Emily, once invisible, walked beside him with her head held high. She was no longer the delivery girl. She was the heart of their mission, the woman who had taught a lion to lay down his roar and listen. One evening, as they watched Daniel play soccer with neighborhood kids, Richard turned to her. His voice, usually so commanding, was almost shy. "You didn't just save my life that night in the lobby. You gave me a new one." Emily smiled, eyes glistening in the fading light. "You saved yourself, Richard. I just reminded you that you were human." In that moment, beneath a dusky sky and the laughter of children, their redemption was complete. He had lost an empire but gained a soul. She had been invisible, but now the world saw her and saw kindness through her eyes. And together they had built something stronger than glass towers, a legacy of compassion. The city never slept. Its towers still reached toward the sky, its streets still pulsed with traffic, its glass lobbies still gleamed beneath chandeliers. But for Richard and Emily, the meaning of those lights had changed forever. One evening, as twilight painted the skyline in hues of gold and violet, their scooter buzzed past the skyscraper that once bore his name in steel letters. Richard glanced up at it, not with bitterness but with clarity. That tower had once defined him, a monument to power, control, and fear. Now it was only a building, empty without the warmth of human hearts inside. Emily leaned into the wind, her laughter rising above the hum of the engine. Daniel sat wedged between them, clutching a bag of donated meals for the families waiting down the block. It was not an empire, it was not billions, but it was enough. And perhaps it was everything. The narrator's voice lingers over the city. True strength does not come from the balance sheets of empires or the marble floors of skyscrapers. It is found in moments of courage. The courage to kneel on a lobby floor when others turn away. The courage to choose love over pride. The courage to see humanity where the world only sees status. The camera cuts between faces. The tired but grateful mother receiving a warm meal. Daniel running across a cracked basketball court, laughter unburdened. Richard and Emily unloading boxes side by side, their eyes meeting in a quiet promise. Sometimes the poorest in the room carry the richest hearts, the voice continues. And sometimes those hearts are strong enough to change even the coldest lion. The story reframes itself. Richard had once believed that wealth protected him, that control made him untouchable. But in his moment of weakness, it wasn't a boardroom or a billion-dollar contract that saved him. It was the compassion of a delivery girl who had nothing, except the courage to act when no one else would. Love had not arrived in candle-lit boardrooms or grand banquets. It had arrived in the rain, in the heartbeat of a young woman kneeling over a man who had forgotten his own humanity. And in that act, Richard discovered a truth far greater than any empire. Sometimes we are not saved by what we build, but by who we allow into our lives. The camera pans wide, showing the scooter weaving through backstreets, past neon lights and towering shadows, carrying not just two unlikely lovers, but a new story of hope. Love, the narrator concludes, arrives not when we seek it, but when we are finally willing to be saved by it. And in every city, in every crowded street, in every overlooked corner, there are invisible people carrying invisible strength, waiting to remind us of what truly matters. The screen fades slowly, leaving only the quiet hum of the scooter and the distant glow of the skyline. The skyscrapers stand tall, but it is the small light of kindness, moving steadily through the night, that feels infinite. For Richard and Emily, the delivery girl and the CEO, their story was never about wealth or power. It was about the miracle of being seen.